I had just returned to my small hometown in Ohio after a month of overseas work, trying to shake off the exhaustion of a long flight and hoping everything at home was still normal. Yet the moment I stepped inside, I could feel something was wrong. I am Dana, 34, and it took only a few steps through the hallway for a cold realization to settle in. During the past month, each time I called to check on my parents, my older brother always answered before they could, and his hurried tone never matched his usual calm. I told myself it was stress or a bad day, but the uneasiness followed me all the way through the airport and into this very moment. I moved toward the back door to bring in the last of my luggage when I noticed it was not fully closed. A faint draft slipped through the gap. Out in the yard, the storage room had a heavy metal padlock I had never seen in my life. That unfamiliar lock made the skin on my arms tighten. I grabbed a small pry bar from the toolbox and forced the hasp open because every instinct told me I needed to see what was behind that door. The sight inside made my voice crack as I called out for help. My parents were huddled in the corner, exhausted, frightened, and barely able to stand. When I asked what had happened, their trembling voices spoke only one name, the same name that had been answering my calls for weeks. I dialed emergency services with shaking hands, and within minutes 2 police cars pulled into the driveway lights, cutting through the dark as everything I believed about my family began to unravel. If you want to follow what truly happened after this moment, feel free to subscribe so you do not miss the next part of the story. Your support helps us bring more powerful real-life stories to this channel. At the hospital, I realized the situation was far more severe than I thought. The staff hurried my parents into an examination room and began checking their condition with a focus that made me grow tense. I followed closely behind them, and every step down the hallway felt heavier as the fluorescent lights revealed the strain on their faces. Mom could barely keep her eyes open while Dad's breathing sounded shallow in a way that frightened me more than I expected. When a nurse asked me to wait outside for a moment, I felt the weight of helplessness settle across my shoulders because I realized I had no idea how long they had been suffering before I opened that storage room door. A few minutes later, a doctor stepped into the waiting area and motioned for me to follow him to a quieter corner of the hallway. His expression was calm but serious as he explained that both my mother and my father were severely dehydrated, physically weakened, and showing signs of extended confinement. The way he described their condition made my stomach tighten because it implied a level of neglect that could only come from someone with access to our home during my absence. I listened carefully as he continued, and although he spoke patiently, every detail deepened the ache forming in my chest. He told me they were stable for now but needed monitoring fluids and rest after what appeared to be a long period without proper care or freedom of movement. I stood silently for a moment before one of the officers approached and asked if they could speak with me. The older officer introduced himself politely and requested information about my family, including any recent conflicts or unusual behavior. That was the moment I introduced my brother by name, for the first time saying that my brother Marcus had been answering my calls for weeks and had insisted several times that I did not need to cut my work trip short. As the officer jotted down notes, I realized how unsettling those conversations had felt in hindsight. Whenever I asked to speak with Mom or Dad, Marcus always said they were resting or busy and he found ways to end the call quickly. I had dismissed it at the time, assuming he was stressed, but now under questioning, every memory felt suspicious. When the officers asked where Marcus was at that moment, I could only admit that I had no idea. I had not seen him at the house when I arrived, and his car had been missing from the driveway. The officers exchanged a brief look before stepping aside to radio dispatch, and the seriousness in their voices made my pulse rise. I tried to stay focused while another officer asked about our recent family dynamics, but my mind drifted to the strange excuses Marcus had given whenever I mentioned coming home earlier. He always said he had everything under control, although he never explained what he meant by that. A nurse finally called me back into the room where Mom and Dad were resting. Seeing them hooked to IV lines made my guilt sharpen. I had been thousands of miles away trusting Marcus to check on them while I worked overseas. That trust now felt painfully misplaced. I sat beside them and held Mom's hand gently, trying to steady my breathing. The more I looked at them, the more determined I became to uncover the truth, even if the answers were worse than anything I had imagined. Work obligations, deadlines, and everything else faded from my mind as a single promise took shape. Nothing would come before their safety again. I needed to understand what Marcus had done, and I needed to make sure my parents would never face something like this in the future. The next morning arrived quietly as I drove back to the house with a determination that steadied my nerves and pushed away the exhaustion still lingering from the long night. I parked in the driveway and stepped out with a sense of purpose, trying to understand what had truly unfolded while I was gone. As I approached the back gate, a voice called my name, with a hesitant tone that made me turn immediately. It was the neighbor who lives next door, Mrs. Helen Brooks, standing near her porch, with a worried expression that seemed to deepen the moment our eyes met. I walked toward her and she clasped her hands together as if gathering the courage to speak. Helen took a shallow breath before telling me she had noticed unusual activity around my place for several days, particularly near the storage room where my parents were found. She explained that she often sits by her kitchen window in the evenings and had seen Marcus walking back and forth between the house and the small storage building at hours that did not make sense for any normal errand. The way she described his hurried steps and nervous glances made the back of my neck tighten. Helen reached for her phone with a reluctant sigh, saying she needed to show me something that had been bothering her since last week. She opened the doorbell camera application and pulled up a series of recordings she had saved. The first clip showed Marcus carrying a heavy cardboard box across the yard while looking around with a tense expression. His movements were strained, and there was no attempt to hide the fact that he was heading directly toward the storage room. Another clip showed him returning much later in the night with another container that looked even heavier than the first. His shoulders were hunched, and there was a strange impatience in the way he pushed open the gate. I watched each clip with a tightening chest, trying to steady my breathing as the pieces began forming a pattern I could no longer ignore. Helen apologized for not stepping in sooner, explaining that she was unsure whether what she saw was serious or simply a private family matter. I assured her she had done the right thing by speaking up, although the reassurance felt hollow when my mind was already racing toward darker possibilities. There was something deliberate in Marcus's behavior, something far more troubling than the typical careless decision he had made in the past. The final clip showed Marcus leaving the property with his backpack slung over one shoulder while dragging a small suitcase behind him. His posture was tense, and he kept glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to confront him. The timestamp placed his departure less than a day before I returned home. That detail made my stomach twist as I realized how closely our timelines had overlapped without crossing paths. Whatever he was planning, he had executed it with enough precision to avoid facing me. Once the last clip ended, I felt a resolve settle inside me. I thanked Helen for showing me the recordings, then stepped away to call the lead officer handling the investigation. My voice remained steady as I explained what I had seen and forwarded the files for review. The officer confirmed that the footage would be added to the case and escalated immediately. I ended the call with a deep breath that failed to loosen the tightness in my ribs. As I walked back toward the house, I tried to make sense of the growing suspicion that Marcus might be hiding financial trouble significant enough to push him into reckless decisions. He had avoided my calls during the last month and brushed off my attempts to check in before the trip. His eagerness to handle everything alone had seemed strange at the time, but now the strangeness felt like something darker. The more I replayed his rushed voice and evasive answers in my mind, the clearer it became that something had been unraveling long before I came home. By the afternoon, I walked into the backyard with a growing determination to understand what had been happening behind my parents' silence. I started going through each corner slowly, allowing the quiet of the yard to guide me toward anything that might have been missed during the chaos of the previous night. The air carried a tension that pushed me to look deeper into the small details Marcus had always assumed no one would question. I approached the trash bins with a reluctance that quickly shifted into purpose, and I forced myself to sift through each layer of discarded items until something caught my attention, beneath a bundle of torn envelopes. What surfaced was a crumpled receipt from a local pawn shop near the edge of town, and the moment I unfolded it, my stomach tightened. The signature near the bottom was written in a shaky imitation of my father's name, a shape that revealed an uneasy combination of effort and dishonesty. I stared at the ink for several seconds before the realization settled further into my thoughts. There were no circumstances in which Dad would have walked into a pawn shop without telling me, and the date on the receipt placed the transaction squarely within the period I had been away on my work assignment. The item listed was valuable enough to suggest desperation or a growing pattern of behavior I had not noticed until now. Beneath the receipt sat a small folded note written on an old piece of lined paper. The message contained a single phrase stating a large amount expressed in words, rather than numbers, something that indicated someone had tried to conceal the true scale of the obligation. The handwriting did not belong to either of my parents, and the uneven strokes suggested a hurried attempt to keep track of the mounting debt. My mind connected the pieces faster than I could manage my own worry. Marcus had been in and out of the house for months, moving with a restless energy that never felt grounded. Now the context behind his behavior began to form into a picture that was far more troubling than the arguments he had tried to avoid. I took photos of both documents, holding the paper steady to ensure the evidence would be clear for the officers who had already been waiting for updates. After sending everything through their secure contact channel, I received a confirmation message that the materials were being reviewed by their Financial Crimes Division. The shift in tone from the officers indicated that these findings were no longer considered a simple family dispute, but had escalated into a case requiring immediate investigation. As I stood in the fading afternoon light, I replayed the last few conversations I had shared with Marcus before leaving the country. He had brushed off my questions about his workload, his spending habits, and the tension that often appeared whenever topics of responsibility were raised. The evasive answers made far more sense now, and the truth behind his actions settled into my thoughts with an unsettling clarity. The idea that he had used my parents' identities to secure loans or pawn valuable belongings without consent created a weight that pressed harder against my chest. I closed the lid of the trash bin and stepped back. No longer confused, but driven by a need to protect Mom and Dad from further harm. There was no room left for hesitation, and I knew the investigation had only begun to uncover the reality he had tried to bury. 2 days later, the police contacted me with new information that they believed could shift the direction of their investigation in a significant way. I drove to the station with a sense of controlled urgency, trying to prepare myself for whatever they had uncovered since the day I handed them the documents from the backyard. When I arrived, an officer greeted me and led me to a quiet room where several folders had already been arranged in an orderly stack, clearly showing that the team had spent considerable time reviewing each piece of evidence recovered during the search. The officer explained that their overnight work had led them to a small apartment rented by Marcus under a separate lease that did not involve any family details, which made it difficult for them to identify earlier. The unit had been located through a financial cross-check that flagged recurring payments linked to an address no one recognized. Once they obtained a warrant and entered the apartment, they found a cluttered desk drawer containing several envelopes, loose documents, and a silver USB drive marked only by a small square of tape. The storage device became their priority, and after examining its contents, they requested my immediate presence. The officer opened a laptop and turned the screen toward me. Inside the USB, there were scanned copies of documents that mimicked legal authorizations. One file displayed a forged signature meant to look like Mom's, granting full access to bank accounts that had been dormant for years. Another file used Dad's name in a mock authorization that attempted to transfer property rights. The officer emphasized that the documents were not only falsified, but deliberately structured to resemble legitimate paperwork, which meant Marcus had prepared them with a plan that extended beyond a moment of desperation. I felt a steady pressure form in my chest as each file loaded on the screen. The officer paused occasionally to give me time to absorb the information and to avoid overwhelming me with details. Although the shock was undeniable, I forced myself to focus because understanding the scope of what Marcus had built was essential for protecting Mom and Dad from further harm. The officer then revealed that they had identified a list of financial accounts linked to suspicious withdrawals. Those withdrawals aligned with the forged papers stored in the USB, creating a chain of evidence strong enough to justify expanding the investigation. Before I left the station, another officer approached and informed me that someone had come forward voluntarily. It was a friend of Marcus, Shawn, who had offered information once he realized the situation was escalating. When Shawn sat with the investigators, he admitted that Marcus had been drowning in private debts that he tried to hide from everyone. According to Shawn, those debts had increased so rapidly that Marcus began searching for ways to secure money quickly, even if those methods crossed ethical or legal limits. Shawn claimed he had tried to distance himself once he understood how risky Marcus's decisions were becoming, but guilt eventually pushed him to speak up. I walked out of the station with a mixture of clarity and heaviness. Every new discovery felt like another door closing behind me, yet I knew each step brought me closer to protecting my parents and to understanding what had driven Marcus into such dangerous choices. 1 week later, I received the call I had been waiting for since the moment my parents were taken to the hospital. The officer on the line told me they had finally located Marcus at a small motel in a neighboring town. Hearing his name spoken with that level of certainty created a strange combination of relief and dread across my chest. I drove to the station with a steady pace because I needed to be present when they brought him in. I was tired of imagining where he might be hiding or what he might be planning, and I wanted answers delivered directly. When I arrived, the atmosphere in the hallway revealed that something significant had taken place. An officer approached me and explained that Marcus had been found alone in a room he had rented under a different name. The room contained a few bags that were packed in a hurry, along with a bus ticket scheduled for departure the next morning. There was also a notebook with several pages detailing a potential route that would take him far from Ohio. The plan looked rushed, but still showed he had been searching for ways to avoid facing the consequences of everything that had unfolded. They escorted Marcus into an interview room, and I was given the chance to speak to him before the formal questioning began. Seeing him in person again was unsettling because he seemed smaller than I remembered, and yet there was still a defensive sharpness in his eyes. He looked at me with a mix of irritation and exhaustion, as if I had disrupted a plan he believed he could still control. I sat down across from him and waited for him to speak first. After a long moment, he leaned forward and delivered the same line he had repeated whenever he wanted to avoid accountability throughout our childhood. He said, "I just needed time to fix everything." The words sounded almost rehearsed, as if he believed that explanation could erase the pain my parents had endured, or justify locking them away so he could use their identities without anyone noticing. I took a breath before responding, because I wanted my words to be calm and clear. I looked him in the eyes and said, "You were never fixing anything. You were only running from what you caused." His expression tightened for a moment, and I could see the brief flicker of frustration because he finally understood that whatever excuse he had prepared would not work this time. The officer standing nearby stepped closer and added, "This situation is no longer something you can talk your way out of." They moved him from the room so the formal processing could begin, and I stepped out into the hallway to gather myself. Another officer approached to inform me that the motel room contained additional documents related to financial activity they were still reviewing. Those findings would be added to the list of charges that were being prepared with the help of the prosecutor. The officer explained that the prosecutor had already begun assembling the case because of the seriousness of the forged documents and the confinement my parents had endured. Later that afternoon, I visited the hospital to check on Mom and Dad. Mom was gaining more strength each day and looked more present than she had during those first frightening hours. Dad had regained more clarity and asked questions with a steadier voice, which gave me a sense of grounding after such a turbulent morning. I updated them on the arrest and assured them the investigation was moving forward with purpose. When I left the hospital, I felt the beginning of a shift inside myself. The arrest did not erase the pain or the confusion, but it marked the first moment when the truth finally stood in the open instead of hiding in the shadows Marcus had created. 1 month later, the trial officially began. A quiet tension surrounded me as I walked into the courthouse and took my seat among the early attendees. I felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle over my shoulders, and although I tried to steady my breath, the hushed conversations in the room served as a reminder of the seriousness of what was about to unfold. I watched officers escort Marcus into the courtroom while he kept his eyes down, and the sight forced a complicated mix of anger and sadness through me. The judge entered soon after, and the room rose before settling again. The prosecutor began outlining the charges against Marcus, which included unlawful confinement, falsification of legal records, and elder exploitation. I listened as each accusation was presented with supporting evidence collected over the past weeks. The prosecutor detailed the forged documents discovered in the apartment he had rented, including the USB that contained the manufactured authorization meant to redirect my parents' assets. I knew these facts well, yet hearing them spoken aloud in a courtroom created a deeper ache. I realized that the damage he caused extended beyond finances because he had disrupted the safety of two people who trusted him without hesitation. When the prosecutor called the first witness, I folded my hands and focused on every word. Shawn, a friend of Marcus, stepped toward the stand. This was the first time I had seen him in person, and although his expression carried discomfort, he answered the questions without hesitation. He described multiple conversations in which Marcus admitted he was overwhelmed by debt. He also recalled moments when Marcus mentioned his intention to take control of my parents' accounts because he believed he could manage them better. His testimony intensified the atmosphere because it clarified intention rather than impulse. Helen was called next. She recounted the evenings when she noticed Marcus approaching the storage building behind our home during unusual hours. She also mentioned the day she reviewed her doorbell footage and noticed him carrying sealed boxes toward the same area. Her voice remained steady as she clarified the timeline. I appreciated her presence because she had been forthright from the beginning, and her willingness to speak reinforced the reliability of what she had witnessed. The prosecutor eventually announced my name, and I moved toward the stand while trying to maintain composure. I felt my pulse pick up when I faced the courtroom. The questions focused on the discovery of my parents, the documents I found in the backyard trash, and the emotional impact of what had happened. I answered clearly because there was no room for uncertainty. When the prosecutor asked whether I believed reconciliation with Marcus was possible, I paused before responding. The room waited in silence, and the pause allowed me to gather the truth that had settled inside me over the past month. I can't trust him anymore, I said. The clarity of my own voice surprised me slightly, although the words felt accurate and necessary. I stepped down from the stand, feeling as though a final thread between us had dissolved. The defense attempted to portray Marcus as someone who acted out of desperation. They claimed he lacked the intention to cause long-term harm, yet the evidence contradicted their narrative. I watched him closely while his attorney spoke. His gaze drifted across the room, and I noticed a familiar distance in his expression, as if he could not fully acknowledge what had happened. The judge listened without interruption before reviewing the submitted materials, including the statements from investigators and financial analysts. The conclusion became clear when the judge began reading the verdict. Marcus was found guilty on all charges. The judge announced a prison sentence that reflected the severity of his actions and confirmed his permanent removal from any future inheritance. The decision brought a mixture of grief and relief. I accepted that accountability mattered more than the bond we once shared. When the session adjourned, I left the courtroom with a steady resolve, knowing that I had made a choice to protect my parents and preserve the stability they deserved. A few months after the trial, life for my parents and me began to settle into a rhythm that felt steady enough for all of us to breathe again. I moved Mom and Dad to a quieter neighborhood that offered better support services and a level of security that gave me the reassurance I had been craving ever since the investigation began. Mom regained her strength slowly while Dad regained enough clarity to recognize familiar routines and enjoy small comforts that had once been overshadowed by constant fear. I spent more time at home because I wanted them to feel anchored in a space where safety was no longer a fragile promise. Helen continued to visit, carrying the warm energy that had helped us get through the darkest moments. She brought small treats, neighborhood updates, and stories, light enough to ease the tension that still lingered in our home. Her steady presence reminded me that relationships built on kindness can grow just as meaningful as those forged by blood, and sometimes they become even stronger when tested through hardship. One morning, a letter bearing Marcus's handwriting arrived in my mailbox. He wrote that he wanted to be understood, not absolved, and that he had never intended to harm our parents. He claimed he had acted under pressure and had been overwhelmed by choices that spiraled out of control. The letter held no real accountability, only a quiet plea for recognition. I read every word, folded the page, and placed it in a drawer that I did not lock. I never responded. My silence was not an act of punishment, but a boundary that I needed to hold. Trust cannot be rebuilt through a single confession written after everything has already been lost. Our days eventually became calmer. I took Mom on gentle walks through the garden behind our new home, and Dad sometimes hummed along to melodies he had loved for years. These simple moments gave me a sense of closure that no verdict or sentence ever could. They reminded me that family can endure deep wounds, but true protection requires the courage to draw lines that keep harm from returning. I learned that the deepest pain often comes from those who once held our trust without effort. Marcus's actions forced me to accept that love within a family does not erase responsibility. Care must be matched with respect, and boundaries must be honored even among relatives. Protecting the people we love sometimes requires stepping away from someone who chooses harm, and choosing peace over loyalty is not betrayal when safety is at stake. Thank you for staying with me until the end of my story. Sharing these moments has not been easy yet. I hope they offered something meaningful for anyone navigating complex family dynamics. If this experience stirred any thoughts or reflections, I would be grateful to hear them. Feel free to share your perspective so we can continue the conversation with empathy and understanding.